I still remember the exact moment my heart broke a little, not for myself but for her. It was a Sunday in late October, the kind of grey, damp afternoon that makes the whole province feel like it's holding its breath before the first real snow. I'd just come back from the grocery store with 2 bags of Thanksgiving leftovers I portioned out for the week, and my daughter-in-law was sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. She didn't hear me come in. I set the bags down quietly and watched her for a moment. This young woman my son had loved for 3 years, who always had a warm word for everyone, who remembered everyone's birthday and never showed up anywhere empty-handed, and she looked completely hollowed out. I said her name softly. She startled, and then, before I could even ask what was wrong, she leaned toward me and whispered, like she was afraid the walls might hear, "Your daughter said I never really belonged in this family, that everyone just tolerates me because of Nathan." I set down my purse, I pulled out the chair next to hers, and I thought, we need to talk about everything, every single thing, right now. Her name is Simone. She's 28 years old. She grew up in Moncton, New Brunswick, the middle child of a Lebanese-Canadian family who came to this country 40 years ago and built something decent and quiet and full of love. She met my son Nathan at university in Halifax. They were both in the same Tuesday evening ecology seminar, and he asked her about a paper she'd written, and she told him later it was the first time a man had ever been genuinely curious about her opinion. That was her bar, she'd said laughing. That was all it took. I loved her from almost the first dinner. She was straightforward in the way that people from the Maritimes often are. She didn't say things she didn't mean, and she didn't pretend to find things funny when she didn't. She complimented my lemon squares and then asked if I'd ever tried adding a pinch of cardamom. And I had to laugh because the answer was no, and she was right. We spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen after that. My son sat at the island watching us like he couldn't quite believe his luck. Nathan and I moved to Ontario when he was 12, after his father passed. We settled in Guelph, close enough to Toronto that he'd have opportunities, small enough that I wouldn't lose myself in the noise of a big city. I work part-time now, just a few shifts a week at a garden centre I've gone to for 15 years. I turned 63 last spring. I have a small house on a street with old maple trees and a grown son who calls me every Sunday, and until recently I thought that was more than enough to be grateful for. My daughter is Ingrid. She's 34, and I say this as her mother, knowing full well what it costs to say it. Ingrid has always had a talent for cruelty dressed up as honesty. She's the kind of person who calls her worst impulses just being real. She says sharp things and then tilts her head a little and adds, "I'm just saying," at the end, as if the disclaimer scrubs it clean. When she was a teenager, I thought it was a phase. When she was in her 20s, I thought it was insecurity. Now I think it might just be who she is, and the only thing I can do is refuse to look away from it. She and Simone had always circled each other carefully, politely. Ingrid made occasional comments about Simone's cooking at Christmas. Lebanese food is fine, I just prefer a traditional dinner. About her job as an environmental consultant. Must be nice to care about trees for a living. About the fact that Simone and Nathan hadn't set a wedding date yet. Some people just like having a placeholder. Each one landed gently enough that Simone never knew how to respond. She'd look at Nathan, Nathan would look uncomfortable, the moment would pass, and nobody said anything. I always noticed, but I told myself it wasn't bad enough. I told myself Ingrid would come around. I told myself Simone was strong and she could handle it. That was my first mistake. The Sunday that changed everything had started like any other family dinner. I'd invited everyone over, Nathan and Simone, Ingrid and her husband, my neighbour Phyllis, who's been eating Sunday dinners with us for 10 years because her own kids are in Vancouver. I made a big pot of turkey soup from the Thanksgiving carcass. fresh rolls, a salad. Nothing fancy. The point was just to be together. Simone had news. She and Nathan had finally set a date, June 14th, at a venue outside Cambridge, small and private, just the people who mattered. She was glowing when she told us, this quiet, careful woman who doesn't glow easily, and I stood up and hugged her over the soup pot. Ingrid smiled, said congratulations, poured herself more wine. Later, after dinner, while the men were in the living room watching the end of a game and Phyllis and I were in the kitchen wrapping up leftovers, Ingrid and Simone were in the dining room together. I don't know what prompted it. I only know what Simone told me afterward, and what I later confirmed myself. Ingrid had told her, quietly, pleasantly, in that conversational way of hers, that the engagement didn't change anything, that the family had been talking, and the general feeling was that Simone was fine, but not really one of them, that Nathan would get there eventually. He always did, but that Simone shouldn't misread Sunday dinners and polite conversation for actual belonging. We're welcoming people, Ingrid had said. We'd be kind to anyone Nathan brought home. Then she'd gotten up, refilled her wine, and wandered back to the kitchen, and Simone had sat there alone at my dining room table for a long time before coming to find me. When she whispered it to me in the kitchen, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, something older and quieter than anger. The kind of feeling you get when something you should have stopped a long time ago has finally gotten big enough that you can't pretend you didn't see it coming. I asked Simone to stay after the others left. I made fresh tea, and I listened to everything, not just from that night, but from the past 3 years. Just saying. Every slight she'd absorbed and filed away, every moment she'd looked at Nathan and seen him go quiet, rather than speak up, every time she'd driven home from my house wondering if Ingrid was right, if maybe she was just tolerated. When she finished, her tea was cold again. She looked at me like she was waiting to be told it wasn't that bad. I didn't tell her that. I said, what she said is not true, and I'm sorry it took me this long to make that clear. She looked at the table for a moment, then she nodded, very slightly, and something shifted in her face. Not relief, exactly, but the beginning of it. I didn't call Ingrid that night. I needed to think clearly, and I have learned, at 63, that the things I say in the hour after I'm hurt are rarely the things I'd choose to say with a full night's sleep behind me. I called Nathan first, the next morning early, before he left for work. He knew something had happened. I could hear it in the way he answered, careful and already braced. I told him what Ingrid had said. There was a long silence. Then he said quietly, "Mum, I know she can be difficult." I said, "Nathan, your fiancé sat at my dinner table last night and was told by your sister that she's tolerated, that this family doesn't really want her, on the same evening she announced your engagement." Another silence. "I should have said something a long time ago," he says. "Yes," I said, "you should have, and so should I. I want to be clear about something. I have never been the kind of mother who takes sides for the sake of taking sides. I have tried my whole adult life to be fair to both my children. When Ingrid was struggling after her first miscarriage, I drove to Toronto and stayed with her for 10 days. When her marriage was rocky 2 years ago, I listened for hours without judgment. I love her. That hasn't changed. But love doesn't make you exempt from consequences. And I had let Ingrid's behavior towards Simone go unchecked for 3 years because it was always just below the threshold I'd set for intervention. I had drawn the line somewhere that was convenient for me, not somewhere that was fair to Simone. That was on me. I called Ingrid on Tuesday evening. She answered on the second ring, cheerful. I asked if she had a few minutes. She said yes. I told her as calmly as I could what Simone had shared with me. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add anything. I just recounted it plainly, the way you'd read something aloud. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Simone is very sensitive." I said, "What you told her wasn't something she misunderstood. You were clear, and it was cruel." "I was being honest," Ingrid said, "about how things are." "You were speaking for me," I said, "without my permission. You said, 'the family.' You implied I feel the way you do. I don't." More silence. "Ingrid," I said, "I love you, but I want you to hear me very clearly. Simone is going to be my daughter-in-law. She is going to be part of this family in every sense of the word, and the way you've treated her for 3 years needs to stop, not because I'm asking nicely, because I'm telling you it has to." She said, "So you're choosing her over me?" I said, "I'm not choosing anyone over you. I'm asking you to be decent. Those are very different things." She hung up. She didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. She sent me a brief, chilly text on my birthday, "Happy birthday, hope you're well," and that was it. No call, no coming over. Ingrid had done versions of this before, when she didn't get what she wanted, a strategic withdrawal, letting the silence do the pressure she couldn't apply out loud. It used to work. I'd always reached out first, softened things, found a way to absorb whatever had happened and restore the peace. This time I didn't. Nathan took Simone to Moncton for the weekend to visit her parents. He told me later that they spent 2 days being fed and fussed over and welcomed in the way that Simone's family does, without effort or self-consciousness. He said Simone cried on the drive back, not from sadness exactly, but from the accumulated weight of always having to earn something in one family that she was simply given in another. I thought about that for a long time. When Ingrid finally reached out, it was a Thursday, mid-November, nearly 4 weeks after our phone call. She didn't apologize. Not directly. She said she'd been thinking and that she could have handled it better. She said she hadn't meant it the way it came out. She said she was just worried Nathan was rushing things. I listened. Then I said, "Ingrid, have you spoken to Simone?" She hadn't. I said, "That's where this needs to start." "She probably doesn't want to hear from me," Ingrid said. "Maybe not," I said, "but you should try." I don't know everything that happened in the conversation between them. It's not mine to know. What I do know is that Simone texted me afterward and said it had been hard and imperfect, and that Ingrid had cried and said things that were almost what an apology sounds like. Simone said she wasn't ready to pretend nothing had happened, but that she was willing to see what came next. I thought that was more generous than most people would have been. Before Christmas, I did something I'd been turning over in my mind for a while. I sat down and wrote letters, actual handwritten letters, not emails, not texts, to both of my children. To Nathan, I wrote about how proud I was of the man he'd become, and about how watching him love Simone had been one of the genuine joys of my recent years. I told him that the family he was building was real, and it was his, and no one had the authority to define it but him. I told him I was sorry I hadn't drawn clearer lines sooner, that he deserved a mother who said the hard things earlier. To Ingrid, I wrote something different. I wrote about love, about how much I love her, and how that love is not conditional on her being easy or perfect or right. I told her that I saw her pain too, the miscarriage, the marriage difficulties, the way she'd always felt, like she had to hold the family's center after their father died. I told her I didn't think she was a bad person. I thought she was someone who'd gotten into a habit of protecting herself by controlling the territory around her, and that it had started to hurt people she didn't actually want to hurt. I said, "There is room in this family for Simone. There has always been room. The only person who made it feel finite was you." I asked her to think about what she actually wanted. Not to win, not to be right, but what she actually wanted 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when there might be children and holidays and decades of Sundays. Did she want to be there for them, Or did she want to be on the outside, correct and alone? She called me the day after she got the letter. She cried properly this time. We talked for almost 2 hours. I'm not going to tell you it was all fixed after that. It wasn't. Real things don't fix in one phone call. But something moved. Something that had been rigid for a long time shifted just enough that there was air in it again. Ingrid came to Christmas. She brought Simone a gift, a beautiful hand-thrown pottery mug from a studio in Allora that she knew Simone liked, because apparently she'd been paying attention all this time, even when it hadn't looked like it. Simone thanked her. They sat beside each other at dinner and talked, a little awkwardly, but they talked. It wasn't warmth, but it was a beginning. The wedding was June 14th as planned. Small ceremony on a property outside Cambridge. Old trees and late afternoon light, about 40 people who all actually mattered. Simone wore something simple and perfect. Nathan could not stop looking at her. I sat in the front row and thought about that October afternoon, the cold mug of tea, the whispered words, the look on Simone's face, and about how close it had come to staying that way, how close I had come to saying nothing again and letting it all calcify. I was her mother-in-law before she was officially my daughter-in-law. That's just how it worked out. After the ceremony, during the dinner, Simone found me at my table and sat down next to me. She took my hand. She didn't say very much. She's not someone who says more than she means. She just said, "Thank you for believing me." That's all. Thank you for believing me. It didn't feel like a small thing to her. And sitting there in the late June light, surrounded by people who loved her, watching my son across the room laughing with her father, I understood exactly why. Some people spend years waiting for someone in their corner to simply say, "I see what's happening, and it matters, and you are not imagining it." I wish I had been that person sooner. But I am glad, genuinely, completely glad, that I was that person when it counted. I've been thinking since the wedding about what actually changed things. Not the phone call, not even the letters. It was something earlier than all of that. The moment I stopped telling myself it wasn't bad enough yet. That's the part I'm not proud of. For 3 years I watched Ingrid land those small, precise cruelties. The comments about Simone's cooking, her job, the fact that she and Nathan hadn't set a date. And I kept moving the line. I kept finding the threshold that would justify my speaking up, and then quietly moving it a little further away when Ingrid got close. I told myself I was being fair. I told myself I was keeping the peace. What I was actually doing was making Simone absorb the cost of my comfort. There's a version of this that ends differently. Simone sits at my kitchen table and whispers those words, and I say something soft and reassuring, and she goes home, and nothing changes. Ingrid keeps at it, slowly and pleasantly, until Simone either leaves or learns to make herself smaller. That version was available to me. I almost took it. What I've come to understand, not from a book, not from anyone telling me, is that the things we let slide accumulate. They don't stay small. Every time I let a sharp comment pass without naming it, I was teaching everyone in the room something, that it was acceptable, that Simone could be treated that way, that my love for her had a ceiling. The consequences of silence are just slower than the consequences of action. They take longer to arrive, but they arrive. What turned it around, I think, was 3 things working together. And I don't mean this in any grand way, just in the plainest sense of what I watched happen. Ingrid is not a stupid woman. She knew what she was doing. What she lacked for a long time was the clarity to see where it was taking her. When I refused to smooth things over, when I wrote her that letter and named what I saw without cruelty but without softening it either, something shifted. She had to sit with the honest picture of herself. And she was intelligent enough to not like what she saw. That kind of honesty, offered with care rather than punishment, is the only thing I've ever seen actually reach someone. And Simona, her quiet steadiness through all of it. She never raged. She never made ultimatums. She absorbed more than she should have had to. And she still showed up, still extended her hand when Ingrid reached out. That took something real, the kind of endurance that isn't passive. It's a daily choice to stay open when everything is telling you to close. What I brought, I hope, was simply the willingness to do what was right, even when it cost me something. It cost me 3 weeks of silence from my daughter. It cost me the comfortable fiction that my family was fine. Those aren't small things. But the alternative, watching Simone spend her marriage wondering if she was wanted, that cost was paid by the wrong person for far too long. The day Simone took my hand at the reception and said thank you for believing her, I understood what believing someone actually means. It doesn't mean agreeing with everything they feel. It means saying, I see what's happening to you, and I'm not going to look away from it. I'm going to name it out loud, even when it's awkward, even when it disrupts the peace, even when the person causing the harm is someone I love. I should have done it sooner, that's the honest truth, but I did it, and that, I think, is the whole of it.